Hello, I'm Katherine Blood, Curator of Fine Prints in the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division. And I'm here with Phil Sanders, who is a consummate artist, printmaker, scholar, teacher, and master printer. And he's going to talk with us about what it means to be this very special thing, a master printer. In order, as a sort of launch point for our discussion, we have a number of things selected from the library's artist print collection, and specifically from our core collection from the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, including works by Bob Blackburn and works that you helped to create and shepherd into the world yourself, working with a variety of different artists. So would you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do and about your relationship with the Blackburn Printmaking Workshop?
Sure. I started at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop in 2006, shortly after it had reopened from a brief number of years where it had been closed due to finances. So Bob Blackburn started the workshop in 1948 as a means of providing a community art space where artists from anywhere, of any religious background, any ethnicity, gender, could come and work without fear or worry of discrimination. Because at that time in New York City, as an African American printmaker, he didn't have anywhere else that he could really print.
Right.
And so he, through the help of artists like Will Barnett, was able to open the first workshop, which was a cooperative space. Artists all contributed what they had in an effort to be able to keep the space open. Mm-hmm. And it was the incubation of what we would call the printmaking renaissance, which is credited with having started in the early 1960s.
The boom, the graphics boom.
And Bob Blackburn was one of the people most responsible for that, and largely due to the fact because of his creative energy and creative spirit and his approach to the medium of printmaking. For Bob, printmaking when he was coming up was a largely recreating the world type of process. So if you think of things like your money, the New York Times, a magazine, a book, a poster, all of those are taking the world as it exists and recreating it in multiple to disseminate.
Right.
That was the ideology that predominated printmaking for centuries. So it was reproducing a painting, reproducing a watercolor or a drawing through the medium of print.
Very
so that you could
commercial, practical kind of enterprise.
Very practical. I think practical is probably the prime example, because when you think of color processes, you think of CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. It's trying to get all of the colors in the world out of just 4 blending. Mm-hmm. So Bob Blackburn's approach to printmaking was radically different. He and Will Barnett spent a number of years in the early 40s to mid 40s playing with the concept of color and the concept of development of an image, using more of a painter's approach. So what I refer to is it as creating a world versus recreating the world.
Sure.
And this was the genesis of what created the printmaking renaissance, this idea that you didn't have to know what it was going to look like before you started, that you could allow yourself to develop the work as you went, as you would with any other medium, especially in painting.
Control the process from the beginning to the end. Exactly. As an artist.
As an artist. And the idea, what we refer to as the multiple original,
yes,
really comes into play in this period of time. In the sense, when someone says, well, how can it be multiple but original? The idea is that working through the process, in the case of Bob Blackburn in that period of time, lithography, it just so happened that it was editionable. So it wasn't that you needed to make an edition for the work, but it was utilizing the tools and techniques of the process because you responded to them artistically.
Right.
It just so happened that you can print more than one.
Right.
And if this way of finding and discovering is kind of best illustrated in a print like this one, which is entitled Faux Pas in 1960. This is one of my favorite prints of Bob Blackburn's. It's a really great example of the painterly approach to printmaking.
Yeah, so painterly.
And so this is Bob Blackburn used his own work as a teaching tool and working in collaboration with artists. And he would show different states of an image, how he was developing it, how he was allowing it to change as it went. And why I really like to use this particular print as an example is traditionally in printmaking, from a commercial standpoint, you think about color blending. And the idea is to use the smallest number of colors possible to recreate the world. But if you're painting, it's not about the smallest number of anything. It's about what it is that you want to make.
Wide open, yeah.
Which means this is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And so Bob had to introduce the concept of opacity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what you start getting is a color that overprints.
Yeah.
And you put white in the ink so that it covers versus blends. and you put white in your red so it sits on top of your orange so that it has a different feel. Versus traditional printmaking, commercial at the time, all of this would have had to blend together.
This has so much depth and
Exactly.
just beautiful
So if you're
terrain
painting,
to it.
Yeah, the terrain I think is probably the best way to describe that. Is in painting, you're working to build texture, and you can use that concept of opacity to hide something or to pull something forward, or you can go very thin, like glazing. And so Bob, with printing ink, used that to his greatest advantage to be able to push and pull things around. So covering up the blue here with a gray, allowing the white of the paper to read like a line or a drawn line. This is something that Bob is really great at as an artist, is utilizing the white of the paper as a mark in and of itself, those spaces between. So as an African American in the early 60s and in the 50s and even in the 40s, Bob was working primarily in abstraction.
Yes.
And a lot of the artists of color and in New York City were working in abstraction were largely left out of the larger conversation of the abstract expressionist movement.
And he made a leap from figurative work earlier.
Exactly. His leap was in the early 40s.
Yeah.
And so Bob's approach to abstraction was similar to what was going on at the time, and he was obviously influenced by other artists who were there because he was working with a lot of other artists. And so because of the community of artists that he created, the studio of artists from the Afro-Caribbean diaspora and the larger African-American diaspora, as well as expatriated artists, Jewish artists from Europe because of the Second World War, there was a very cross-cultural mix of artists in the studio. And so a lot of different ideas were being exchanged, and many, many artists' perspectives on their own work were also altering because of these direct person-to-person experiences. And so many artists have commented about Bob Blackburn's period when he was alive with his workshop, and the period of the time that I was running his workshop, about that cultural exchange being the most important thing.
Right.
Bob always used to say, if you are an artist and you meet another artist, you speak the same language, whether or not you...
Universal, international,
Exactly.
crosses all boundaries.
And he said if you could do printmaking, you could have a little bit more detailed conversation.
Yes.
So for me, it was always a wonderful thing when talking about Bob and his work, how he would use the work as the entrance point. And so when you start thinking about the different things that were being worked on in Europe, especially in France in the 20s, between the wars, a lot of those artists' ideas were coming over into New York, but they weren't necessarily filtering into the fabric of New York City based on the way New York was segregated at the time.
Right.
But Bob's workshop was that oasis from the city, and it's what he always strove to make the workshop, is that in New York City, you're one of millions of people. He would bring many, many artists into the studio that had never made a print before, and they would say, well, why do I need to make a print? And he would say, well, why do you need to do anything? He's like, because you do.
Yeah.
And because it's what drives you. And he said, printmaking is always the place where you can see something and learn something about yourself that you would never see before. And what he means by that is, in printmaking, you're working backwards. So in the case of lithography, you're drawing on a stone or a plate. And because the paper is laid onto that matrix, it passed through a printing press and then peeled off, the image is mirrored. So printmaking, like ceramics, there's very few artistic mediums where you get to be the viewer of your work just like your audience, not just the creator. Because yes, you've made these marks, but you've made marks in black, now it's going to be inked in a different color, and then it's going to be backwards. So the first time you get to see the work is just like someone else who is an audience member viewing your work. So it allows you to see yourself with greater clarity.
It's a special way of thinking, this duality that
Exactly.
is
So for some
native
artists,
to
it's
this.
the greatest thing. And for other artists, it's very unsettling to actually see your work the way others see it. So some artists would run screaming from printmaking, and it would take them a while to come back. But Bob always had a way of making people feel very comfortable in the studio. And so what we understand of as the modern master printer, Bob's really created that concept, the concept of collaboration, so that you're working with a very skilled technician who's not just obeying orders, but they're providing advice.
Right.
And they're providing input from a perspective that is not their own personal creative perspective, but from a perspective that would help the artist, help them make their own work through this new medium. So it's a sounding board, and it's a push and pull of a collaboration of saying, well, how do you want this to feel, and what do you want this to do? Like, these are the types of questions that we use as master printers. We don't say, tell me what color. We'll say, tell me how you want it to feel, because if this color were different, it would behave differently. And I think that's kind of a good example to show a range of Bob's work, how he would take the same concept or approach that he was going for and visually experiment with it over time. It's theme and variations. Bob was very much influenced by music, especially jazz. He was very good friends with lots and lots of jazz musicians. Max Roach was a very dear friend of his.
Yeah.
And so this kind of idea that you can have a steady pace or rhythm within a work.
Improvisation.
Exactly. And so you can clearly see that throughout this, and this is, we're looking at a 10-year period of time about.
This is 1958.
1958. And so it starts here, and you can see him experimenting with the pink, having a lot of white in it to help cover.
The color is amazing. He's such a great colorist.
Because this undertone of purple is actually this purple here. And so it's being pushed back, creates another color, but it also allows this to function almost as a black, even though it's not black. And so he was really, really great at using positive and negative space, creating tensions within the work, getting the most out of a single color to make it feel like different things in different places. But
opacity and transparency too.
Exactly. That was really one of Bob's greatest contributions. So was dealing with it as you would a painting. So you can change it. You can change your world. You don't have to have your world planned out. So that concept of creating your world is so important to printmaking at this period of time, because one of my favorite, most famous statements was Robert Rauschenberg. So Tanya Grossman, the founder, director of Universal Limited Art Editions in 1958, when they opened up, she had sent a letter to Robert Rauschenberg inviting him out to the studio. He was a very young man at the time, to make some prints. And his famous response was, the 20th century is no time to start drawing on rocks. And so, you know, of which he has probably eaten his words the most out of any artist I've ever heard of.
He's had such amazing success with it.
And he's probably one of the most prolific printmakers and one of the greatest innovators of the medium that there has been. And his foundation and start with printmaking was with Bob Blackburn.
Right.
And so you can see in Bob Rauschenberg's work, his theme and variations within a process. And so you can see Bob Blackburn introducing a process to an artist by using his own work as an example, saying, just because I have this mark here, one, doesn't mean it has to stay in the orientation. As you can see, he's reoriented the print in 3 different ways. So this particular mark, printed in black, it gets to be different.
And sometimes he signed on 2 edges so that you could choose your desired viewing angle.
Right, because Bob recognized the value in personal interpretation.
Right.
And he didn't believe that it was his right to think for you.
Right.
He believed that it was his right to create something that was interesting enough to cause you to think.
I'm glad you made this point, though, that he was an accomplished artist in his own right, and that's true of you too, and that makes a huge difference in being a master printer and collaborating with other artists. I think that's key.
Yeah, Bob felt that it was extraordinarily important that if you're going to advise someone on how to do something, that you know how to do it yourself.
Sure.
That you've been in their position.
Right.
So you've understood the problems, you know, creative block, maybe not really knowing the balance of one thing to another, needing to spend that time with the work, or staring at it.
Right.
And so for Bob, he never really considered anything finished. He used the process of lithography to re-explore a theme over great periods of time, because he could print it in pink, he could print it in green, he could print it in yellow or blue, and leave them on separate pieces of paper, and then come back to one of those pieces of paper in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or even 10 years later. There are certain periods of Bob's work where he'll have an image of work on 1960, again in 1970, again in 1980. He was constantly thinking about that theme and tweaking things.
That comes back to your multiple original point, and the idea that this was not really a fixed edition in a traditional sense. That wasn't interesting to him, apparently.
Not at all. He was probably the best lithographic technician of his time, one of the greatest collaborating master printers of all time.
Right.
And for him, nothing was static.
Yeah.
And so when a lot of people think about printmaking, they think about that kind of concept of permanence. But for Bob, he's like, once the ink is on the paper, it doesn't mean it has to stay there.
And rigidity, because you're either carving or you're tied to the matrix, but it's incredibly,
it was
it's
very,
a dance.
very fluid.
Yeah.
A dance, Tanya Grossman was very famous for saying that, referring to lithography as a dance.
Yeah.
It was this balance of the printer and the sponger, and the printer with the artist, of constantly moving with one another. Absolutely. And so the same thing comes in with collaborative.
It's a good segue.
I think it's a great segue. So if we come over here and we talk about Grace Hartigan's print here, she did this at Universal Limited Art Editions in 1960 in collaboration with Bob Blackburn.
Yes.
This print is a great example of how lithography can be a sculptural drawing process. So many people think, when they think of lithography, they think of very flat or very thin films of ink. because it's a planographic process, meaning the positive image area and the negative image area is on the same plane. And it's due to the fact that grease and water resist one another that the process works. So you draw up the greasy material, you dampen the stone or plate, roll over with the greasy ink. Because grease and water resist, the ink will only stick where the greasy drawing was and not to your image. So and Bob Blackburn was famous for saying, if you put it on the stone, I can get it on the paper.
Right.
Which is a very great technical challenge due to a variety of things. The largest being the wild card of the artist. So the artist is concerned about an image, not necessarily how they got it on there.
Right.
So a lot of different things will happen. So in the case of this particular print of Grace's, all of these light gray areas here were actually this black. And she had painted on there with a very greasy material with a large brush, and then decided that value structure-wise it was too dark. And so she took a razor blade and scraped it down to lighten it.
Yeah.
And because of the grain, it's very sculptural. So there's positive and negative drawing processes. What you can do on a stone, a lithographic stone, you could never do to the paper. If I did that to a piece of paper, I would just shred it. And so a lot of people say, well, why would you make it a lithograph versus just doing a drawing on paper? And the main reason I always talk about is that you can do things in the print media that you can't do in others. Yeah. And whenever you're focusing on what the medium does best, you make the greatest prints.
Right.
So in the case for this print by Grace Hartigan, what's so beautiful about it is the way she came to the final image through that sculptural drawing process.
Right.
So she couldn't do that on a painting. She couldn't do that on a piece of paper. She could really only do that on a lithographic stone.
Right.
And the stones in and of themselves, and you are nice enough to have brought a small one here, stones like this.
Small but heavy.
Small but heavy. This weighs a solid 10 pounds. Stones like this is how they were used in industry, really up until the Second World War. And outside of the United States, after the Second World War, due to the fact that all metal was being used to rebuild the world. And during the war, stones were still used because metal was going towards the war efforts. So the United States ended up surpassing the rest of the world at this period of time in printing technology because we didn't have to rebuild our full infrastructure of the rest of our nation. And so we immediately after the war switched to metal plates. So, but this gives you kind of an idea, images backwards. So this was being used for a lumber company.
Right, 1880s.
They're 1880s, their bill of sale. So lithography was invented in 1798 or 1797, some scholars debate. So by Alois Senefelder, a German, I'll call him inventor. And it was invented for the purpose of reproducing sheet music.
Right, practical.
And very practical. And at the time, you would have to do an engraving of every instrument within the orchestra for a new symphonic composition. Being that it was the pop music of the time, composers really wanted their music to get out to the widest audience because that's how they made their living, was by selling it to other cities or monarchies to have it played at court. And if you didn't have access to get that out, which was very expensive to have it hand transcribed and even more expensive to have it engraved, your music was unknown.
Right.
And so Senefelder said, well, this is great. There's all these people out here, and I can make this happen. So he took small stones like this. He actually made a briefcase lithography press, and he traveled southern Germany. And the fascinating story, historical story about it is he was trying to invent this concept of being able to print in a planographic form. And he was really trying to do it on metal, on copper plates at the time. But the chemistry knowledge at the time didn't allow for the technology to advance to where his idea of what could be. And so he went to a laundry, he had some errands to run during the day, and he went to a laundry and he was forgetting his list of things to do in the day.
The famous story, yeah.
Right, this is the famous story. So he writes with a grease pencil, which they used to write on the tags at the laundry, on a doorstop. Now this is Bavaria, southern Germany. And so he's like, I'll bring this back, I promise.
Ding.
And so he goes and he does his errands and he comes back, he had to pick up his laundry and drop off the stone, and he says, here, I'll clean it for you. And when he cleans it off, he saw that it left a ghost of what he had written in the stone, and that was his moment. And that's the story of lithography and the creation myth of lithography. But almost immediately, yes?
Well, before we leave this, I have to have a little librarian moment about the Grace Hartigan really quick and mention that this is related to a poem by Barbara Guest. So if you think about this as a primary document, as a research object within a research library, so it speaks of abstract expressionism and ULAE and the graphics boom, and you can approach it so many different ways. But I have to, we have bragging rights because this is called The Hero Leaves the Ship. And this is a poem by Barbara Guest. And in our archive of recorded poetry and literature, we have Barbara Guest reading the poem the year this was made. So I just have to have a nerd moment there for a second.
Another kind of thing that I think is also important to point out about why this print was made in kind of context with poetry was Tanya Grossman's love and passion of the artist book, as well as poetry. So she actually founded Universal Limited Art Editions for the purpose of making artists' books in limited edition, and then being able to have trade publications made for larger dissemination, so that the artists' work, both poets, writers, and artists, could work together. And Frank O'Hara worked with Larry Rivers on a combination print called Stones. That was a wonderful thing. And so, kind of to connect Universal Limited Art Editions and Bob Blackburn a little bit, Tanya Grossman, she was a Russian-born Jewish woman who her father was a publisher, newspaper and book publisher, who during the Bolshevik Revolution sent his daughter to Germany to live for safety's sake. And that didn't last very long due to the rise of Nazism in Germany. And she married a German Jewish artist. They ended up having to flee to flee to France, and then flee to Spain, and then came to the United States. And in the process, their daughter had passed away, which was a very sad story. And so her life's story, in a lot of ways, put her in an understanding with Bob Blackburn at the time. So if you think in 1958, African-American printer who's had to start his own print shop because he can't print anywhere else. She asks Bob to be the first master printer for her print shop, Universal Limited Art Editions. They could work with one another because they had a shared experience of discrimination and people not necessarily believing in them because of who they were or their religion, how they looked. And so there was a wonderful relationship there that I think created an environment that allowed artists to feel more free. Tanya Grossman was doing a couple other amazing things, also working with women who are abstract expressionist artists in the 60s as well, who were largely left out of the conversation at that time.
Getting more attention every day.
And now especially.
Every day.
But so you can imagine her workshop was this place that was an extension of Bob's philosophy. So while Bob was working as the master printer for Universal Limited Art Editions 3 days a week on Long Island out in West Islip, he was still running his cooperative workshop in the city. Bob is, and in many ways we kind of think of him as an art angel. He really took care of everyone. What most people don't know about Bob is that he gave virtually everything he ever earned and ever owned to the workshop and his artists. He was actually living in the studio for about a third of his life. He lived in the Chelsea Hotel for a third of his life. And it was because he felt that this body of work, the printmaking workshop, was so important, and that helping artists be able to realize their own creative vision was so important to our culture. And to provide those types of opportunities was so important that it was his role, it was his place.
So then he also wasn't a great self-promoter for his own work.
He was the worst.
And so it's only been in the last couple of decades that really there's a great deal of sort of scholarly attention on his incredible contribution to the history of art and printmaking.
Art and printmaking, and also seeing him as an artist.
And
I think that's really one of the things, as many people know about him for his role as the founder and director of the Printmaking Workshop, his role as a collaborating master printer, and his contributions to the field of fine art lithography, and our understanding of what it means to be a master printer. And so today it's easy for a lot of young people to take for granted the role of the master printer and the concept of collaboration. But when Bob was starting out, that did not exist. And so I think what he's done relative to that part of the field is firmly established and people understand, but not so many people know that he did it because he was an artist too.
He needed a place to work and create it.
So I mean, why the first printmaking workshop was opened was in large part due to Will Barnett telling Bob that he can't continue to sit on Bob's bed while sponging a stone. So Will Barnett and Bob, so Bob would be printing and Will would be sitting on Bob's bed sponging a stone. And he's like, you need a bigger shop, Bob. And so Bob actually did live in that first workshop.
Thank goodness that conversation happened.
Exactly, because Bob was not a businessman.
Right.
Bob was not a self-promoter,
right.
but Bob was a promoter of the arts, printmaking, and other artists.
Right.
So many, many artists of color got their first start in galleries in New York City because Bob would introduce them. I think it's that openness and inclusiveness that allowed him to work with, say, an artist like Grace Hartigan, who'd never done a print before.
These are her first lithographs.
Exactly, and so you can imagine you're already pushing a new kind of concept in art. You're working, abstract expression is very new. People don't necessarily have faith in what it is that you're doing as an artist in the larger art community and collecting community. And now you start working in a new medium. So it takes an unbelievable amount of skill on behalf of the collaborating printer to calm the artist down, to help provide a mental space where they can make their work, to help them lose the concept of failure. So to say, well, if you don't like it, we can grain it off and start again. We can throw this away. You don't have to keep something that you don't love. And a lot of it has to do with the fact of people's understanding of printmaking, by and large, is that it's recreating a world. But if an artist comes in and says, you know, I have this idea, or I have this creative problem to solve, and I don't know how to solve it, that's what we want brought into the
give and take and the negotiation and the collaboration creatively.
Exactly, because if you already can do it, I tell artists, if you already can do this thing, do it in your studio. It'll be more efficient, you'll make more money, you'll be happier.
Yeah.
Now, the problem you can't solve in your studio, that's the problem you bring into the print shop, because now we can all get engaged in this thing that needs to be solved.
Good.
And that's really where we want to focus.
Good, good, good. And so we're lucky to have in the collection here at the library an actual original matrix, a woodblock that was Bob's.
Yeah, so I mean, this definitely highlights something that a lot of people don't necessarily know about Bob's work if you're not really familiar with the larger body of it, that he was not just a lithographer.
No.
Bob experimented in all printmaking media, and it was kind of one of the things that really got him going, and he would bring elements of woodcut back into lithography and elements of how you think about ink and ink films from lithography into woodcut, which really helped him get into this area of color, abstract, woodblock prints, which for the time when he was starting to do it, it was revolutionary. People didn't think this way in woodcut.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times you had very black and white, or you were going more like ukiyo-e, which is lots and lots of color, but very tight, and those were reproducing watercolors, essentially. And so Bob's approach to it, as you can see here, this is the block that is printed in this beautiful kind of maroon that was printed here. And he was not using just a single block and just a single color. So he would carve a block, print it, kind of get the feel of what it was and what it may need, and start carving other wood blocks to then fit into those places. So in this case, you can see that the gray block was printed first. And this was more to act as kind of a flat or an undertone. But one of the things that I really like is that Bob was not using what we would call fancy wood. He was using wood that was there. He was responding to things that he saw. And so this is a knot from a piece of pine. So it was not a prime woodcut plank.
The title here is important to mention, woodscape.
Exactly. And so he really liked wood for what wood was. He would find a piece of wood that he liked. So it may have some ambient marks from use or kicking around the studio, or like in this case, it had a knot. And this in and of itself is, when you kind of look at the composition and the form of it, really starts to come into play here and allows white to be a functional color.
He makes the most of it. He uses it.
So then the other thing that he's done here is he's used a separate block to print over in black, as well as this wood block here, and he's accentuated the grain.
Yes.
So using a wire brush, he can work away the softer portions of the wood, and the harder portions of the grain will stay raised, and that's what takes the ink. And that really highlights the fact that this is a woodcut versus, say, a linoleum cut, which is about flat films of ink and flat applications of color. This is really about getting that feel.
It really shimmers, you know, it's got a lot of movement.
Exactly, and so you have to really think about, you know, the time period that Bob was really experimenting a lot of woodcut, late 60s, early 70s, is
and this is 80s.
And this is an 80s
We've made
print.
a leap in time.
Exactly, but if you look at these three prints together, what we really see is Bob working with the same kind of visual components and concept, but varying them greatly. So this black print, woodblock print here, is actually the same key block that is this kind of mustard tone here. But obviously orientation has been changed again, and this has been worked out in a full color format.
Yeah.
And this print was actually done after this print.
I love seeing them together.
Exactly.
It's just, it really speaks of what he does.
So you can see that in this period in the early 70s, he was really thinking about his woodcuts in the terms of these kind of very bright colors, some and somewhat acidic colors. And as we get a little bit later into the 70s, he was actually taking that back to early kind of graphic form, and then it leads to here.
Psychedelic period here.
Exactly. It was
but
the 70s.
I really love this. I love just the sort of formality and weight.
And it's so beautiful. And like here you
black
can
hole black.
Exactly, and that's kind of the printer's black ink that he really loved to use too. And here he's actually kind of mimicking wood grain. He's kind of cutting it, which then leads us to just going for the wood grain. But it's this idea that he can bounce between things, he can revisit an object and print it and change it again, that nothing has to stay static.
Right.
I think that openness to printmaking is what really created the field of print as we understand it today, which is mixing and matching processes. Not feeling that just because you work in one medium, say woodcut or lithography, that you can't learn or use elements of another process.
It's like being
in yours.
multilingual, just it's all
Exactly.
available in your toolkit.
And so Bob, I would say, you know, if you were to refer to him as a musician, he didn't just play jazz, he would play classical music
Sure.
and rock and roll.
Yeah.
And he'd play it all.
Yes.
So he was that
All the
kind of-
creative languages.
Exactly. So that was really Bob. So when we think about what was going on in his studio at the time, sometimes it was an artist who came in and Bob would see something that would influence him as an artist. And sometimes artists would come in and see something that Bob was doing and that would influence them as an artist.
Sure.
So you have to really put it in the context of the place that this stuff was made in as well.
Right.
And it's also New York City at that period of time. There was a great deal of change going on in the city from the 50s into the 80s.
Right.
The art market was changing dramatically. It was opening up. More people were getting involved in it. More artists were being able to make a living through their craft. And this was the only period in time, 1942 to about 1982, or 1945 to about 1982, where artists in global history, where artists of socioeconomic diversity could be an artist.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that had to do with the GI Bill.
Professionally.
Exactly. So when you think about historically, artists were typically the children of wealthy individuals because this doesn't have consistent pay. But there was this period of time where a lot of young people were able to get art education at a higher level through universities and other academic institutions and able to practice their craft. And so there was this wonderful period of time where you had such a diversity of socioeconomic voices as well as religious perspectives and cultural perspectives from people from different parts of the world. And Bob's workshop really represented that fully. And that's why you can kind of see him evolving through these types of things.
And every aesthetic style, you know, just
Exactly.
and that also is carrying over into the work that you have personally done as master printer and collaborator.
Right. So the work that I focused on as the director of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, which is a program of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, was really Bob's philosophy. That same level of inclusion and openness, that there's not an aesthetic of the workshop, that it's about a diversity of voices and perspectives that are able to work in collaboration as well as work with one another in a very open and communal environment.
Right.
So it was my responsibility to maintain, or as I refer to as the stewardship of Bob Blackburn's workshop. He passed away in 2004 before his workshop was able to reopen, which is unfortunate because he didn't get to see that actual manifestation, but he knew it was happening.
And he dreamed it, and he laid the groundwork for it.
And it was very hard for him. I mean, you have to remember he gave his entire life to his workshop, and it was a big decision to decide if and how it should carry on without him. And he made all of those difficult decisions to make it possible. And so it was my responsibility to come in and help the workshop reestablish itself because it had been closed for a period of about 5 years.
Yeah.
And allow the doors back open to get that openness and access to artists from anywhere in the world, and to let them know that their space is back, it's still theirs, it still functions. Even though Bob's not here, his spirit is still the guiding force of the workshop. And that was really my responsibility there at the workshop. But it was my job to create an environment where they could explore it and help others understand it, where people could interact with one another and their work could grow.
And we have some amazing examples, so
let's talk
why
about
don't
a few of
we
those.
have a look at some of the things that you personally have created.